So pass this information on. I think we have filled all of the executive board positions, so if anybody was scared of that, we're looking for a trustee. And we will probably pursue all of this at our next board meeting, which will be, I can't remember, the second Tuesday of the month, and then we'll come back to you. But if you're interested in anything, some of the things we're looking for is, we're going to need to coordinate the cleaning of the Little Red Schoolhouse eventually. And we need to do cleanup at the museum. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of dust. There's a lot of dirt. There was a lot of construction in that building going on in the fall and during the winter because of redoing all the apartments and stuff. So it needs to be cleaned. We need, volunteers to do that. And there may be other things that pop up. And so if you do have a special desire, I know, some people are willing to make phone calls to get people, etc. Okay, so also we need docents for the museum. And that is always a problematic area also. So anybody that's interested in history and sharing that time, we have had very dedicated board members there every Saturday. And it's winter, so it's a good place to go and to hang out and talk and, learn about history and just talk. And we've had a lot of walk-ins, people bringing things in. We're making a lot of changes there. We've invested in a scanner, which is a plus. We're investing in a real copier. If you've ever been there and needed a copy, you might get it. And maybe 2 hours later, it might start working. So we're upgrading, our antiquated equipment. The biggest item that we are undergoing that I'm aware of, no, it is the biggest item that we're gonna take care of this year is the preservation of the Little Red Schoolhouse. That has been, it's in dire straits right now. Supposed to go up there and take some before pictures and a lot of photos. There's a squirrel living in the roof. There's a lot of rot. There's a lot of the roof is got some really thick moss on it. It's saturated. It's got 4-inch gutters on it that don't belong there. The bell needs to be redone. The stand that the bell is sitting on is rotten. So there is a huge project that will be done starting in May, and that is going to be. I'm going to lead that project. And we are going to work with the Boy Scout troop as an Eagle Scout project. And all of the work that's going to be done will be donated by the roofer. This paint, I think they're going to paint, but there's going to be, we're going to put some drainage in so when that water runs off, it doesn't splatter along the bottom and re-rot. We're also going to extend that roof line so the water isn't pouring down. And we're going to put a metal roof on it. That's one of the biggest things, which we hope to not have to do that in my lifetime. So that is going to be done. It'll be done very quickly. You'll see they're going to be doing some fundraising. So some of you will probably chase you down for some donations or some materials or something. But there's a couple small items I still have to wrap up to finalize this. This is going to be done in May. And very quickly, you won't even know what's going on, and we're going to go in and out of there so fast. Anyway, so also, if there are speakers that anybody in the audience or subjects that people want to hear and talk about, we will listen and entertain that. And you may know of people who know subject matter and want to come and speak, please let us know and try and help us out, because that's an area that, we have a couple slots for this year to be filled, and we'll figure out how to fill them with show and tell or whatever we decide to do, and that's all I can think of off the top of my head. Pretty soon the visual environment is going to be putting out a notice about cleaning up roadways and garbage pickup. These are things you don't need to be a member of the Visual Environment Committee to do. It's just a nice thing that we do. And There's also going to be some work, you know, over at Union Cemetery, picking up the wreaths and picking up the old flags. So watch the space for these things and get out there and volunteer. It doesn't matter what you do. We run this town on volunteers. Be a good neighbor. Help your neighbor. That's all I have. Does anybody have any questions or anything you want to talk about? Okay, we got a lot of talk going on here. You be quiet. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so our guest speaker tonight, we have some cookies and water in the back, so don't be shy. Anything else? All right, so now, Jeff Urbin is no stranger to the Historical Society, nor is he to the town of Hyde Park or the FDR state or anything. He doesn't need an introduction, really. He's been here before. I do have one for you, a little one, but it is always a pleasure to welcome him back, and he brings his materials and information with him. He's a great speaker. And in case you didn't know, I'll just refresh your memory that, are you still the educational specialist?
I am.
All right. And the director of the Pierre Lorenz Film Center at the FDR Presidential Library. He's responsible for developing all of the library's educational programs, offerings, and materials for students ranging from grade school to adult education, right? And you've been there since 2001 now.
Yeah.
Been there a long time, Jeff.
I had hair when they hired me.
Oh, boy. And you probably have a little color to it, or, okay. Anyway, he's also taught history and government for public and private colleges in the Hudson Valley for more than 10 years before that, right? And Jeff has received numerous awards and accolades for the work in the National Archives, and we consider him, and I'm sure you do, an expert in that area. And I don't need to say any more about Jeff because he'll tell us, or you'll see him in action down there. So welcome, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me back. It's wonderful to be in and among history geeks. Woohoo! Right? You know, we get a lot of students in over there, and it's weird to me, but some of them aren't really into history. I don't know. I guess it was like me and statistics. You know, it took me three years to get through statistics, and you know, and the only thing I learned in statistics was there was a 50-50 chance I was going to pass. I thought that was statistics enough. But anyway, thanks for having me back. I'm here tonight to talk about the Roosevelt Presidential Library, surprise, surprise. But I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Roosevelt Presidential Library, talk a little bit about how it was that we came to be, the kinds of things that we do, and why it's a pretty big damn deal to have a presidential library right in your own neighborhood. And it ever amazes me, or ceases to amaze me, that I'll talk to people and, you know, I'll tell them where I work, and they'll go, yeah, I always wanted to go in there. Yeah, I always wondered what they do in there, you know? So there's still people, believe it or not, that are out there that haven't been over there in, you know, roughly the 85 years that we've been over there. So we're trying to make sure that, you know, we get the word out. So how is it that we came to have a presidential library right in our own backyard? Well, the concept of presidential libraries themselves began with none other than George Washington, the nation's very first president. And because we had just gone through the Revolution, 8 years of Revolution, almost 10 years of the Articles of Confederation, which was, you know, basically useless, and we then create the Constitution, and the Constitution in Article 2 creates the President of the United States. If you read the job description for President of the United States, it's about a paragraph. That's all it is. It's about a paragraph. So when George Washington became our nation's first president, he understood that he was kind of building the presidency as he was flying, right? Building the machine as he flew it. And he also understood that he was in a unique position in the sense of the skills set that he had. He had been head of the Continental Congress, he had been head of the Continental Army, he had been a big shot landowner in Virginia. He knew how to get things done. But he was frightened about about the folks who might follow him, right? We'd spent 8 years in the Revolution, and he knew that if the United States of America didn't work, that the British would be back and, they would take back over again. So he wanted to make sure that the folks who followed him in office would have the best chance of being successful as possible. And he wasn't so sure that was going to happen. So everything that he did with this mind of, I've got to set a good precedent. I've got to do the right thing. And a couple of things he just created out of whole cloth. One of them was the executive order. There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about there being the ability to have executive orders. But George Washington was now the chief executive. He used to be a general, used to giving orders, so now he's giving executive orders, right? He's saying, here's what I want done. And it was challenged in the courts, and the court said, well, there is a necessary and proper clause in there, and it's necessary and proper for the president to be able to give executive orders. So that's how we got executive orders. George Washington just, brought them up out of thin air. Now, there used to be this thing about you could only be elected for 2 terms, and that was only a suggestion. That was only a tradition. George Washington had served for 2 terms, and he said, we don't want another King George around here. I'm getting out of here. Time for some fresh blood, for some new blood. And that created the tradition of having just 2 terms for the presidency. It wasn't a law. It wasn't a law until the 22nd Amendment, which was passed in 1951, but went into effect in 1953. And it went into effect because of a guy who lived not too far from here, Franklin Roosevelt, who had been elected not only twice, but a 3rd time and then a 4th time. And so the Republicans, and I'm not being political here, this is just the truth, were kind of nervous about that, right? And they've been out of the White House for 20 years, and they said, we got to do something. We got to put some term limits on here. They pushed it through. It became the 22nd Amendment, and then they got Eisenhower. And they're like, rats, right? Because they would love to have had Eisenhower for a 3rd term. So the 22nd Amendment, as a result of Roosevelt's 4 terms, is how we get the 2-term limit. But traditionally, it was set by George Washington himself. Then the other great idea that he had was the idea of a presidential library. He wanted to make his papers available for future presidents so they could see how the job was done. So that 3 or 4 presidents down the line, if you're having a problem with France or you're having a problem with Britain, you could go back, look through the documents, and get a sense of, all right, well, here's what we said, here's what they said, here's what we signed, here's what they signed, and you'd have a documentary trail, evidence of how the job was done and how the job should be done. So when George Washington left office, he went back to Mount Vernon, and he took all of his reports and maps and papers and letters and all those sorts of things, and he took them back to Mount Vernon with the hope of organizing them so they could be used by future presidents. But before he had a chance to do that, he died. And with him died the concept of the presidential library. In fact, many of George Washington's papers were actually destroyed. Anybody want to take a guess at how they were destroyed? Fire. The number 1 wrong answer. But if you had a guess, that's good, right? Because everything was, open flame cooking, open flame heating, no 911, no fire extinguishers or those sorts of things. So it wasn't fire. Mold. Water. Theft? Sort of. How about this? Many of George Washington's papers ended up looking like this. Rats. Really good mice. Really good mice. Rats. So it wasn't just historians that were hungry for history, but rats as well. Okay? And because George Washington was a fancy guy, and he wrote on fancy paper, parchment paper, the poor rats couldn't help themselves, right? Did you mean to eat up all George Washington's papers? No? Are you kind of sad that you did? No? Okay, we'll talk to you later on. All right, so anyway, that's what happened to a lot of his papers. And with him died the concept of the presidential library. So we lost a lot of our presidential history from Washington all the way on up to Franklin Roosevelt. Sometimes the papers were placed in wet, damp basements, right, where they became moldy and musty and deteriorated. Sometimes they were placed in hot, dry attics where they became dusty and brittle and deteriorated. Sometimes if a document had a presidential signature on it, it would be cut off, the signature sold for its autograph value, and the document simply discarded. There are reports that Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, actually destroyed a lot of Abraham Lincoln's papers. It was because he became a big shot in the Pullman Railroad Company, and it was kind of uncool to have a dad that was, born in a log cabin. Now there's a place over in, I think it's New Hampshire, Hildene. Anybody ever been over to Hildene? Robert Todd Lincoln's house. And I always like to go over there and give them a hard time, like when we go in, they go in the kitchen. Here's the kitchen, and here are the pots and pans that they used, and here's the stove, and they would cook on the stove. Okay, any questions? I have one. What else did they do with that stove? Right? And there went a lot of Abraham Lincoln's papers. So when George Washington, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, he said, I'm getting us through a Great Depression here. And historians are going to want to know how we got through this. So I want to make my papers available so that 100 years from now, and by the way, we're almost there now, 100 years from now, people can see how we got through the Great Depression. So he calls up the Library of Congress, right, and you're historians, right, so you'll understand this. It was long distance. And he asks them, hey, do you guys want, now the kids don't understand what that is, right? So you have to go, or this. So he asks them, hey, you guys want my papers? And when he tells them how many papers he has, they say, well, how many you got? He says, well, I got quite a few. And when he tells them, they say, we can't take all of that. No way. We'll take a couple of these, a few of those, one or two of these. And he said, no, you don't understand. It's a collection, right? And it has to be kept together. So you take all of it, or you take none of it. And the Library of Congress said, okay, we'll take none of it. And the number that Franklin Roosevelt had in his documents is 17.5 million pages of documents. Right? A quarter of a mile from here, from where we are right here, right now. Now, good, right? You guys know documents, right? So, right? But put that in perspective. That 17.5 million pages of documents would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument, which is 555 feet tall. So if you stack them all on top of each other, 16 Washington monuments, that's what we have in our archive right down the street here. Some of the most important documents of the 20th century. For example, the D-Day prayer, one of my favorite pieces of writing of all time. The prayer that the president read over the radio to the American people as the boys were running up the hills and running up the beaches on D-Day. The Day of Infamy speech, right, the famous Day of Infamy speech, right next door here, right down the street, it's there in the vault. Plus the 29 fireside chats, plus thousands of letters from ordinary people, plus reports, mementos. He had a big history collection. He had one of the largest naval collections of books and documents and pictures and things. This guy was, today we'd probably call him a hoarder, okay? But, we would call him a historian. Woo, there he is, right? So we have 17.5 million pages of documents in that building. We have about 35,000 museum objects in that building. And we have about 50,000 books, 23,000 of which belong to President Roosevelt himself. He was a lifelong book collector. He was not a cover-to-cover reader, he was a spot reader. He read what he liked, and when he didn't like it anymore, he would jump to the next part of the, kind of like channel surfing with us today, right? That's how he did it with books. And we have about 150,000 images of the president over there. So this is why this presidential library is here. Roosevelt was the first to build a presidential library, and he built it at a cost of $376,000. That building that you see over there, right? Have you had your house appraised lately? Okay, incredible, right? And he had it built on property that he didn't really even own. He signed over 16 acres of property of his mother's property. All right, so remember when your kids, you go away on vacation or something, go away for the weekend, your kids would have a big house party, woo, right? Well, that's what FDR did. His mother went to France, and he said, oh, now's my chance. And he signs over 16 acres of property to the federal government for the presidential library. And of course, she wasn't going to embarrass him, so she said, oh, all right, right? And that's how it ended up getting across there. It was built from 1939 to 1940, opened in 1941, cost $376,000 to build, and it was built literally with Dutchess County fieldstone. Now, the Roosevelts were known for being cheap, for being frugal. Frugal is that's the word I was looking for. And so, to cut costs, he had stone walls taken down from the property, and he was able to house the outside of the building with the fieldstone. It's built in Dutch colonial architecture, which was his favorite type of architecture, and you see the various post offices and things around the valley. Interestingly enough, that when the WPA built post offices, right, they built post offices all around the entire country, there was only one county in the whole country that got 5 post offices built. He was taking care of the homeboys, right here in town. We've got 5 WPA post offices here in Dutchess County because he was taking care of his neighbors. He was taking care of his friends. And I don't mean that in a mean way or a bad way. I mean, he understood this was his home. These were the people that he cared about, the people that cared about him. Although he won the presidency 4 times and never carried Dutchess County. Okay, so they didn't care about him that much, I guess. But anyway. Okay, so he was the first to build this presidential library, and then he gives it over to the National Archives and Records Administration. Now, the way this worked was that back in the day, each government agency, each government department took care of its own documents. Right? So if you were the Defense Department, you took care of your own records. If you were the Agriculture Department, you took care of your own records. And some folks took better care of the records than others. Some of them had them nice and neat in little filing cabinets. Many of them didn't. They just stuffed them places, right? Up in the attics, down in the basement, under the thing, in the window wells, under somebody's bed, wherever they happened to find the stuff, space for the stuff, they would stick it in there. And by the 1920s, it became apparent that we weren't really keeping very good care of our records. In fact, the Declaration of Independence, which is 250 years old this year, spent the first 76, oddly enough, years traveling around the country, traveling around Washington. That's why it's so faded, right? Because they just thought, oh, let's hang it up here, it looks good. Put it up here. It was in Independence Hall for a while. It was in, Congress for a while. And, they finally realized, hey, this thing isn't going to be around forever, man. We got to take care of this stuff. So, in the 1920s, they began to think about this. And it wasn't until 1931 that they decided to build an archive building, which is now in Washington, D.C., and that is Archives 1, right, headquarters. And then in that building, you have the big rotunda, and there you have the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Bill of Rights, and about 40 billion other pages of documents. Right? So they've really collected these things over the years. And so they built that building, and then in 1934, Franklin Roosevelt created the National Archives. Okay, so they said, well, build an archives building, we'll just stick everything in there. But then he created the National Archives, and they had something like 80 employees to gather up all the documents from Washington, from all the history of America, and to organize it and to put it all in one place so that people could begin to use it and such. And today, the National Archives has 40 sites across the country. A1 in Washington, D.C., right up the street from the White House. A2 out in College Park, Maryland. And then 40 sites scattered across the country. And the presidential libraries are part of the National Archives and Records Administration. Okay, so that's who we answer to, the National Archives down in Washington. So, Roosevelt builds his presidential library, and he builds it with private money. So he takes his hat, he passes it around, he collects up $376,000, builds the building, turns it over to the National Archives, and that's how we get the first presidential library. Every president since then has said, hey, that's a good idea. And they've built presidential libraries as well. And that's the way it started. So there's 14 currently in existence to one degree or the other. Some of them are just what they call papers projects, where they're still just collecting the documents and the papers and catalog, and all that sort of stuff. And there are, let's say a half a dozen operating presidential libraries across the country. And to have one right here, not only a presidential library, but the nation's first presidential library. Not only the nation's first presidential library, but the only presidential library ever used by a president while he was actually president. FDR built the library, as I said, 39 to 40, and then opened in 41. He built it toward the end of his second term, fully expecting to retire the presidency at the end of the second term, as good old George Washington had done. But by 1939, Roosevelt is concerned about two things. Number one is his domestic legacy, the New Deal. Right, the New Deal has become under attack in the courts, okay? And they're declaring things unconstitutional, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Recovery Administration. Social Security just squeaks through. And so Roosevelt says, wow, if there's not a strong, decent Democrat to follow me in office, they're going to dismantle my legacy, everything I've built for the last 8 years. So the only decent, strong Democrat he saw was the guy in the mirror every morning shaving. He said, oh, I bet you that guy could do it. Right? So that was one thing he was concerned about. The other thing he was concerned about was Adolf Hitler. And one of the cool things of history is that Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt come to power within 6 weeks of each other, and they died within 6 weeks of each other. So somebody was looking out for us. You got pure evil and really good on the world stage at precisely the same time. I get goosebumps when I say that. And I told somebody that once, and they said, oh, it's just the air conditioning. I said, no, it's history. It's what it is, it's history. So he builds the presidential library. It's complete. He uses it for the entire 4 years of his third term, and then the 83 days of his fourth term. And he dies on April 12, 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia. So the museum office, the office that the president studied, is as it was when President Roosevelt was here last time he was here in March of 1945. When you go in there, it's not a reproduction, it's not a recreation, it's the real McCoy. And I always like to go over there and, standing there alone, if I can get away from people, just standing there alone and think about the history that took place right there. Right? Outside of Washington, D.C., London, Berlin, and Tokyo, that building, Hyde Park, was the center of the world in the 1930s and the 1940s. Right? FDR returned here over 200 times as President of the United States and used that building as his office. Just like Trump goes to Mar-a-Lago, right? FDR would come up here to Hyde Park. And this really was the center outside of Washington, D.C. Also a little teeny bit in Warm Springs, Georgia, but that was really more of a vacation place. This was really where he came back to work and recharge his batteries and his energy as such. So every president builds a presidential library. And what happens is, because George Washington took his papers with him when he left, he started the tradition of the papers belong to the President of the United States. And that's the way it was all the way on up until Ronald Reagan. So there was a guy, let's see, I think 1969 to 74. What was that guy? Let's see. Oh yeah, Nixon, right. So Nixon becomes president. And he has some troubles, right? Most of them he brought on himself, but nonetheless, he's got some troubles. And he gets involved with Watergate, and he ends up getting almost impeached. And just ahead of being impeached, he resigns the presidency. So he says, all right, I'm out of here. I'm done. I'm going, right? And in the weeks leading up to that, he begins to pack up all this charts and graphs and letters and memos and reports. And there might even have been a box of tapes, I don't know. And he says, okay, I'm getting these things out of here. And the Congress of the United States says, oh, no, you're not. You're under investigation, criminal investigation, for obstruction of justice. We want to see what you have in those documents before you get them out of here. And Nixon says no. Every president since George Washington has taken their papers with them. Yeah, a couple smarty pants like Roosevelt, giving them over to the people of the United States. I'm taking mine with me. And there was a famous Supreme Court case, people of the United States versus Richard Nixon, and we won. Okay, we won. So the papers were removed from the White House, placed in College Park, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., where they were then there for the next 35 years, while while the government argued back and forth with the Nixon daughters as to who actually owned the papers, and back and forth, and they eventually came back to the National Archives. First they went out to Urbin, California, some of them, and then they had the rest of them here, and then they transported them out to the Urbin, California Nixon Presidential Library, which was not an official presidential library at that time, but then once it became part of the National Archives, that's when the papers were moved out there. Now, to prevent that from happening again, a law was passed during the administration of President Carter, and it went into effect with President Reagan, which now makes the papers of the president the property of the people of the United States. So in FDR's time, right, if he got 100 Christmas cards, he could pick his favorite 20, throw the rest out, and it was considered his papers to do that. Today, you send something into the White House, it's kept, it's cataloged, and it eventually becomes part of the public record. Now, I was talking to a school group one time, a group of teachers, and I said that, and there was a young teacher, and she raised her hand. She said, did I hear you? So anything you send to the president is kept and cataloged and becomes part of the public record? I said, yep, anything you send, because, and I don't know what she sent, but all the color just flooded right out of her face. So I'm just counting to when those things become, unclassified. So be careful what you write, right? Be careful what you do. So today, there is a member of the National Archives who works in the White House, making sure that things are kept and cataloged, and the public record becomes the public record, and it becomes part of the National Archives and Records Administration. And these places, these National Archives, these presidential libraries, these Library of Congresses, these local historic organizations are critically important to our democracy. They are more important now, I think, than ever before, because we now live in a world of artificial intelligence. Right? It would have been nice if we just gone to regular intelligence first and then artificial intelligence, but a lot of people I know skip that. So you have a situation where we now have artificial intelligence. We have fake news. We have alternative facts. And that's what makes this place over here, places like yourselves who are, preserving buildings, preserving documents, preserving artifacts, so critically important, because they are the authentic places to get the original item, the original document, the original photograph, or the original artifact. And from that, we can learn. And from that, we must learn. Somebody once said the only thing that the only thing history teaches us is that we don't learn anything from history. Right? And I think that's kind of true sometimes, but we can never give up. But we have to keep on it. We have to keep working on that. So let me share with you a couple things that we have over here in the archives. Basically, in that building over there, and this is, I gave a talk to the Chamber of Commerce a couple of weeks ago, and it was fun because, this is a big reason why people come here to Hyde Park, right? Because of the presidential library. And when we have the government shutdowns, a lot of the businesses feel it, right? Especially the restaurants, right? I mean, I know, hey, I didn't get like this by eating salad, you know what I'm saying? So, it's an important thing to bring in tourism. It's an important thing to bring folks in. And if you go anywhere in the world and you tell them you're from Hyde Park, they'll know about Franklin Roosevelt. They'll know about Eleanor Roosevelt. Why? Because so much history was made here. These two folks lived here. These two folks are buried here. And so many of the documents are still there. We have the busiest research room in the presidential library system. 800 to 900 researchers a year come and do our research in our research room. And that's because so much of the world we live in is the world that was built by the Roosevelts. President and Mrs. Roosevelt, right? I mean, everything, you know, like, it's funny, like, when you think about the world today, I gave a talk last night about Frances Perkins. And I said, you know, if anybody's ever worked an 8-hour day, you would thank Frances Perkins. If anybody's ever worked a 40-hour week, you would thank Frances Perkins. If none of you worked in a factory or a coal mine when you were 5, you could thank Frances Perkins. And it goes on and on and on, right? And she was part of the New Deal, right? And that was the world that we lived in, right? And many of you were union members, right? Well, you can thank, you know, the Roosevelt administration. Frances Perkins, you know, Senator Wagner, you know, those sorts of things. So much of what goes on in our lives today started in that era, come from that time. And it all started really right here. So let me show you a couple of things that we have. Basically, the way things break down over there is into 3 categories. There's documents, there's photographs, and there's artifacts. Right? And most of you will know that because you guys are historian types. Right? So how do we learn? We learn from documents, we learn from photographs, and we learn from artifacts. So let me share a couple of those with you. One of the first ones I want to show you, and I have, this is one of my favorites, is FDR's birth announcement. Okay? So this is where our story begins, with FDR's birth announcement. And he doesn't have an official birth certificate because he was born at home and the doctor didn't bring one with him. So his father sent out the birth announcement. And what I love about this document, and I use this with students all the time, is you look at this one document, which really looks more like a picture, right? And from this, we can see his name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? So we know his middle name is Delano. And if we know anything about fancy families from that time, we know that very often the middle name was the mother's maiden name. So we know his full name, his mother's maiden name. We know he was born on January 30th, 1882, in a snowstorm. We know that his mother and father were Mr. and Mrs. James Roosevelt. And we know that he was born in Hyde Park because his father wrote Hyde Park on the stork. Can you imagine if FDR had been born someplace else? Huh? That would have been a scandal, okay? He's delivered like in Wappingers, hello, James. So we know that. And we also know that he was called FDR right from the beginning because his dad wrote FDR on the bundle. So from this one document, which is really more of a picture, we learn FDR's mother's maiden name, we learn his birthday, where he was born, what his nickname is, and what his name is, right? All we need are the last 4 numbers of his social security, and we can steal his identity, okay? Not that we should do that, I'm just saying, right? But imagine that. If you could learn all of that from one document that looks like this, imagine what you can learn from 17.5 million pages of documents. Right? That's why this place is so important. That's why. Let me show you another one. These are all on our website if you want to go home and take a closer look. This is a copy of the Day of Infamy speech. And what I love about this is it's got FDR's corrections on here. So he dictated the speech to his secretary. She typed it up on a thing called a typewriter. Right? Kids don't know what that is either. And then she handed it over to him, and he said, let me take a look at this. So he begins to look at this, and he said, I'm going to change this, I'm going to switch this around. And the thing that everybody points to is so cool, is that originally it said, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history. Kind of nice, right? It's no Day of World History speech, right? It's the Day of Infamy speech. FDR says, that's not going to work. And he crosses it out and he writes in infamy. And part of the reason for that is nobody knows what infamy means, right? So they got to go look it up. And they look it up and like, ooh, that's not good, right? That's a bad thing these guys did to us. So it's a date that will live in infamy. That's pretty important. That's kind of fun. But I think there's even more important information in that first sentence. I love the first word, yesterday, December 7th. The president doesn't address the country until the next day. So he's got 16 hours, 20 hours to think about what he's going to do. to gather in the information, right? It's not like today, where the minute something happens, it's on our news feed, right? Hey, guess who just fell down a well? Who? You know, Lawrence O'Grady, I don't know, right? So, all that kind of stuff. No, this is a time when he's got 12 or 16 hours, 20 hours to think about what he wants to do. The world was a bigger place then. And who was the first person to address the country after the attack at Pearl Harbor from the administration? Eleanor. Now, technically, she's not in the administration, right, because the First Lady is not an official part of the government. But Mrs. Roosevelt, on the evening of December 7th, Sunday night, was supposed to go on the radio. She had a scheduled appearance on the radio to talk about, of all things, her Christmas shopping. Right? Well, we were still in the Great Depression, and she was going to go on there and gin up, sales. So listen, folks, you can go out and buy things because it's going to be good to, for people to get gifts, and it's going to be good for the economy, blah, blah, blah. And she goes on and she says, I can't talk about that. She said, well, folks, as I talk to you tonight, right down the hall, the president is meeting with members of Congress, members of the military. You all heard something happen today, and, I know you're nervous. I'm nervous. I have 2 sons in uniform as well. And the president will talk to you tomorrow, so just try to get a good night's sleep. Everybody chill out, right? And we're going to talk about this tomorrow. The president will address you. So once again, Mrs. Roosevelt on the cutting edge, right? Out in front of the president yet again. But that yesterday is very important. The other thing I think is really cool is if you look at this, there's a caret, one of those marks, and a dash, and another dash back here. So what President Roosevelt has done is he's given himself stage direction on how he wants to deliver this speech before Congress and before the world. And the next time, if you haven't been over there, it plays in the museum every 5.5 minutes. You'll hear him say, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, dramatic pause, dramatic pause, dramatic pause, a date which will live in infamy, dramatic pause, dramatic pause, dramatic pause. The Empire of Japan, he wants that sentence to hang in the air. This guy knows how to deliver a speech, right? This guy knows that that's going to be the sound bite. That's going to be the thing we're talking about 85 years later. And interestingly enough, the president, our current president, was just talking about this the other day. I'm going to leave it right there. Okay, so then we also have photographs. Here it is, here it is. FDR and his dad. All right, so a lot of times I'll ask the students, and they go, hey, who's this? Is it Eleanor? Eleanor? Oh, she's wearing a dress. Right? She's wearing a smock. That's what fancy people wore because it was easier to change their diapers if you're wearing a smock, right? You ever try to get a kid in and out of a onesie? Right? I don't know. Yeah. My wife would go, he's not a wrestler. You'd be old like this in the onesie. I don't know how this thing goes on. So I love this because it tells a lot, right? So first of all, you see that Franklin's father looks more like Franklin's grandfather because he's 57 years older than FDR, right? Kind of out of the realm usually of when folks are having kids, but this is James' second wife, and he's making a baby with her, right? The other thing you'll notice is just how damn cute that kid is, right? That is one cute baby picture. Now, I have not seen a baby that cute since like December when I was at my parents' house looking at baby pictures of me. And by the way, I still have the original hairstyle. And then you also notice he's holding roses. Why? Because he's a Roosevelt. He's not a Daisy Belt, right? He's a Roosevelt. So you can learn a lot about this just from one picture, just by looking at one image. So this is how most people don't remember FDR. This is how most people remember FDR, right? The prime of his life, there he is. He's got the cigarette thing. He's hanging out in the car. He's got the big jaunty grin there. He's probably looking at one of your ancestors, right? Because he's right here in Dutchess County. And that's the FDR that we tend to think about and tend to know. But I want to show you 2 other pictures. This is a color photograph of FDR. And what you'll notice about this is the guy's got blue eyes. Right? Move over, Frank Sinatra. Here's the original blue eyes, okay? And you can see just how good looking this guy turned out to be, right? This was a picture taken in, I believe it was September or October of 1944. And it was put out in color because the rumor was that that FDR wasn't doing so well, that he had all kinds of medical issues and probably shouldn't be running for president for a fourth term. So they put this picture out and says, does this guy look like somebody that's not doing so good? Does this guy look like he's not up to the president? Look at this guy, right? This is a central casting for president. So this was a campaign picture, September or October 1944. This is a picture of Franklin Roosevelt on April 11th, 1945. This is the last picture ever taken of Franklin Roosevelt, the day before he died. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage the next day. You can see he's not fitting in his clothing, right? He doesn't fit out his collar, he doesn't fit out his cuffs, he's got the dark circles under his eyes. The war is killing him, right? He's got congestive heart failure, the last photograph taken of FDR. So again, you can learn a lot, right? Look what happens from 6 or 8 months later, looking like this. This may have been doctor, just a term. But, right, you get the idea. Okay, so you got that. And then we also have, in our collection, objects, or as, the curators call them, artifacts, right? Artifacts. And I want to show you this. Any idea what this might be? A hat? Somebody said? A helmet? Okay. Anything else? Lampshade. Oh, okay. I bet you're fun at a party. Right? Yeah, those are usually, sometimes it's a salad bowl, right? But whoever said helmet is correct. This is a World War II Japanese Army helmet. And this tells the story of why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. They were at a point where they ran out of steel. The United States was selling the Japanese steel and oil. We're in the Great Depression, we're trying to make some money. We're selling them scrap steel, we're selling them oil. And the Navy says, hey, this isn't so good. You want to know why? They're using that oil to power their ships and planes. And they're taking over places like China, right? And they're using that steel to build tanks and ships and planes and helmets. So in the summer of 1941, the United States puts an embargo against selling Japan steel and oil. And Japan says, rats, right? She says, we can't get that from them, we got to get it from somebody else. They got so desperate, they were making their helmets out of bamboo. And so they decided, we have to attack Pearl Harbor. We'll bomb Pearl Harbor, we'll knock out the United States in the Pacific Rim, and then we can take over anybody we want from there on in. There'll be nobody that can stop us. And that was the idea behind the attack at Pearl Harbor. And, you got this as a real live, genuine artifact that shows how desperate they had gotten at that point. Okay? So, documents, photographs, and artifacts. And I want to show you one last thing, and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers. So we have the nation's first presidential library over here, only one ever used by a president while they were actually president. FDR, a damn big deal. How do we know that? Because he was president for 12 years, got us through the two greatest crises of the 20th century. And I was always trying to get kids to understand this. He was, did a lot of stuff. Oh, did he? He did a lot of stuff, right? And so then I had this friend who was, when I taught, this guy was a science teacher. Right? And he was always going on and on about that periodic table of the elements. Every element, periodic table, everything you see is made up of these elements. Right? I was like, oh, that's great. Like he was responsible for it or something, right? So one day I got to thinking, and I said, you know what? I'm mad, man. How come we don't have one of those for the social sciences? So I created, a periodic table of the New Deal. Right? This is why Franklin Roosevelt was a damn big deal. Because he created 44 programs of the New Deal. Everything that impacts our lives today, from the airwaves that our phones use and the frequencies, all the way on up to the Social Security check that you are collecting, or many of you are collecting, or will someday be collected. 44 programs of the New Deal. Did he do it by himself? No. He had a group of really smart people working for him. Francis Perkins, one example of many. And I got so tired of that damn, periodic table of the elements. I said, we're going to have one. And I, just to mock them, I modeled ours after theirs. So where it has the periodic table, the atomic number up here, and you can flip it over on the back, and it's got a little piece of information so that you can then say, oh, what's the CCC? You got 21? You look up 21, and it tells you a little bit about CCC. But wait, there's more. He also got us through the Second World War. So we came up with a periodic table of World War II. And this has got the good guys on one side and the bad guys on the other. We're not supposed to say that because we're supposed to be historians, we're supposed to be objective. But if you're talking about Hitler, I think you're on fair ground saying bad guys. Some of the major events that occurred, some of the major players, and again, where the atomic number is, you flip it over to the back, and you've got the number there that you can begin to look up information and such. That's why you should be proud to be a person from Hyde Park. That's why you should be especially proud to be members of the Hyde Park Historical Association. Because there's history around this world, there's history around this country, but there ain't no history like the history that was made right here in Hyde Park. We are living in the world of Roosevelt. Whether you like it or not, that's the world we live in. Is it being challenged now? In some ways it is. Okay? Yes?
Can we obtain a copy of the 41 programs chart that you have somehow?
Well, let me ask you a question. How much would you be willing to pay to have a beautifully handcrafted color chart like this, similar to the periodic table of the elements that you'll find hanging in my friend Jason's house?
We're going to need it laminated so we can flip it around.
Oh, so you'll need, I'll put you down for an order for 2, excellent. But they really make a great set. So you really should get all 4 of them, right? That's what you really should do. We send these out, these have been sent out, over 10,000 copies of these have been sent out to schools, classrooms all across the country and around the world. I bumped into a guy on St. Patrick's Day, and he was actually Irish, and he was here, and we got to talking, and the guy goes, oh, what? No, you're kidding me! And I'm like, what? The periodic table, oh yeah, we got one, right? So, that's my Irish imitation, in case you didn't know. Yeah, so these things are pretty darn popular out there, and the whole idea of this is that you gotta show what this guy did, right? You gotta show what this guy and this gal were able to do, and they did it all from right here. Now, Sharon, I'm going to give you a discount. Okay? Actually, you can have this copy. You can have the actual copy used in tonight's presentation. Okay? Now, we'll talk about signing it. So, now, what's so cool about this is someday I'll take my grandkids to the Hyde Park Historical Association, and these will be hanging there. And we'll have that there. You can get copies of these. All you got to do is just let me know. Shoot me an email. Give me your mailing address, or if you're close by, you can stop in and pick up a pair, if you like. That's one of the things that we've been very, very happy about and proud about, is that we're able to make these available to teachers free of charge. And it really does help kids to understand, wow, so that's why they're still talking about this guy, 85 years later, 90 years later. Okay? Any questions, comments, or snap remarks? Yes, Carney Ryan, all over there. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, in the archives at the library, are there any love letters that either went to Roosevelt or he sent to somebody else?
From you? I'm just wondering if you were, are there love letters that he sent to, well, the American people loved their president. And they sent thousands and thousands and thousands of letters, espousing affection and such. If you're talking about the Lucy Mercer letters, those are no longer around. The family, I think, rid of those. But, so there's no real, I would say, love letters per se, but people really felt connected. And you know, more people wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt than President Roosevelt, because they felt closer to her. They felt the president is busy, he's running the country, but you know, Eleanor's not doing anything. I'll just write to her, and you know, so she was the softer touch in terms of that.
The reason I asked the question, I'm a licensed land surveyor,
Okay.
and I survey people's property. I happen to be surveying a property over in Millbrook, and the neighbor, I go talk to the neighbors when I'm surveying the property, and it happened to be a guy named Mr. Rutherford. And I knocked on the door, and he saw my vehicle, it said Hyde Park, New York on it. And he said, "You're from Hyde Park?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, my step-grandmother was Lucy Mercer Rutherford."
Oh.
And I just couldn't believe it. And he says, "Yes, I have portraits of her." And he got out some really high-class
Scotch?
portraits of Lucy Mercer Rutherford.
Wow.
He didn't have any stories because it was his grandmother, and
Right.
it didn't get to him. The stories didn't get to him.
Yeah.
But here we are, even though we got all this history in Hyde Park, there's some over in Millbrook.
Yep, absolutely. And that's the cool thing about the library. So Lucy Rutherford was Eleanor Roosevelt's social secretary. And Eleanor Roosevelt didn't want to go to receptions and things with FDR in Washington because she had 5 kids at home. She was exhausted by the end of the day. And she didn't like to be around alcohol. And she was, kind of shy and everything. So she stopped going to these receptions with FDR. And she said, "Well, you got to take somebody else. I'm not going anymore." And he says, "Well, who can I take?" And she says, "Well, how about my social secretary, Lucy Mercer?" And everybody loved Lucy. I know that becomes a show later on. But at this point, everybody loved Lucy Mercer. And so Franklin began to go to these parties with her, and they fell in love. And they ended up having an affair. We don't know when the affair began, but we do know when it ended. And it ended when FDR came back at the end of the First World War. He had a touch of pneumonia, and they were afraid it was going to turn into the big flu epidemic thing that everybody's having in 1918. So he dropped all his stuff in the lobby of their home in New York and went upstairs to go to bed. And Eleanor began to unpack this suitcase, and she found this satchel of love letters. And she read just enough to see what was going on there, and she offered him a divorce. And he said, no, let's work it out. And he said that because 2 people gave him advice that said, no, you better stay married. One was Louis Howe, who was his political advisor, and said, you can't run a marriage, how are you going to run a country? How are you going to run a state, right? You got to stay married, otherwise your career's over. And then they heard from an even higher authority, his mother. And, and she said, there'll be no divorce in this family, pal, okay? You found Eleanor, you fell in love with Eleanor, you married Eleanor, you cheated on Eleanor, you make it right. And if you guys get divorced, I will cut you off from the Roosevelt family fortune. Sarah maintained control of the Roosevelt family fortune until she died in November of 1941. President Roosevelt died in April of 1945. He was only in charge of the Roosevelt family fortune for about 4 years or so. And so what happened was they stayed married. And it became really more of a partnership at that point than a lovey-dovey kind of marriage. But as I understand it, those are the kinds of things that they wanted to get rid of pretty quick and early. So I have a feeling that they spent a roasty evening by the fire, throwing those in there. Yes, sir.
Well, wasn't Lucy there again at the end in Warm Springs?
She was there at the end again in Warm Springs. Well, you guys know all your dirt. That's great. So here's how that happened, okay? So he promised her he would never see her again. And he kept that promise for many, many years. And then they started getting reconnected and re-in-touch. And then she was down there at Warm Springs, Georgia. He was sitting for a portrait, having his portrait painted. She was in a chair over on the side, and he had the stroke. And around 1 o'clock, he didn't recover consciousness and then died around 3. And they packed up Lucy Mercer, and they got her out of there. And then Eleanor came down to be with the body and bring it back to Washington. And she said, I don't know everything was going on, what was happening, what was he doing, blah, blah, blah. And somebody let slip that Lucy Mercer was there. And she was like, what? What? He told me he would never see her again. And she said, how did this happen? Who was responsible for this? And Anna, the daughter, she's over in the corner going, right? It was her, Anna, who got them reconnected. And when Eleanor heard that, of course, she was devastated. Wait a minute, what are you talking about? You're my only daughter, and you're reconnecting your father with this woman he had an affair with? And Anna's defense was, Mama, when you're president of the United States, everybody that comes through that door wants something. Papa needed to be with people he could just be himself with. They didn't want to be with him as president of the United States, didn't want him to give a speech or put something in the budget or, sign a bill, just to be around him because they loved him and because of who he was as a person. And Eleanor Roosevelt looked her in the eye and said, you're right. That's what he needed. It's a good thing what you did for Papa. She forgave her. Right? That was my kid. Like, all right, that's it. You're not using the car. Get to your room. No TV, nothing. But yeah, so she was there at the end. Yes, sir.
When Roosevelt built the library, did he build the storage facilities for the 17 million pages, or did that come later? And where is all that? Is that all underground or something? Or
Why
where is all that? I've been in here. It's not that big.
You weren't the guy with the shovel. I came through. There was a truck with some shovels in the back. That wasn't you. He built the original building, the horseshoe-shaped building, and they calculated up about how much space they were going to need and all that sort of stuff. I don't know if you know this, but the building's actually 4 stories tall. Right? It only looks like it's 2 stories tall. There's one floor completely underground. There's the ground floor, and then up in that big pointy roof, there's two stories. George could tell you more about it. He used to be the facility guy over there years and years ago. So the building is big, bigger than it looks. And then he said if you ever have to add on, you can add on to the north and to the south. So that's where you get those 2 wings on there. So yeah, everything's up there in what we call Hollinger boxes. Good thing you asked. This is a modern-day Hollinger box. And we have about 22,000 of these in the collection over there. They hold anywhere from 800 to 1,000 pages of documents. And this is what the documents are kept in. Now, the original Hollinger boxes look like this. And these boxes, believe it or not, were designed by a guy right here in Hyde Park who happened to be a 4-term president of the United States. Roosevelt designed his own damn Hollinger boxes, right? And he's got a patent for it. And it was designed in what's called a clamshell design. Okay, so when it shuts down, it closes over itself and it keeps all the light out. He also wanted it to have reinforced metal corners so if it bumped into things, nothing would get hurt. And he would have a little piece of ribbon put on the side here, and then there would be a shelf, 3 boxes, a shelf, 3 boxes. So he could go through, pull a little ribbon, push the other 2, they would stay on the shelf. He could open this up. He would open it up like this, and it creates basically a little shelf, a little table for him, right? Because he was in a wheelchair. If he dropped anything, he couldn't pick it up by himself. So this gave him the ability to work with his papers very independently. And when it came time to upgrade the Hollinger boxes, and even says right here, property of Franklin D. Roosevelt Library. And when it came time to upgrade to the new Hollinger boxes, they kept a lot of this initial design. They're still built as a clamshell. They still have the metal reinforced corners, but now instead of a ribbon in the middle, they have a string at the end. So it sits on the shelf and you can just pull the string out and there it is there. This guy was busy, right? I mean, it always amazes me, right? If I have to go to the bank and the dry cleaner in the same week, that's a big week for me, right? This guy's fighting the Great Depression, he's getting us through a world war, he's building a presidential library, he's messing around with Lucy Martin. I mean, this guy's busy, right? This guy's busy, and yet he still finds time to design boxes for his own presidential library papers. Yes, right.
You mentioned about all the different archives around the country. Is it ever an issue as to where papers should go? Or is there some kind of priority system that answers all those questions?
Well, back in the day, the papers were put wherever the president wanted them to be put. So sometimes they were put like with colleges or universities. Like let's say the president went to like Columbia University, so later on he gave his papers to Columbia University. But today what they do is they stay with the National Archives. And it's actually become pretty big business to have a presidential library because it is an economic engine. You know, we have conferences, we have school groups that come through all the time. You know, we have researchers and all that sort of stuff. So usually what a president will do is they'll put their presidential library someplace that was important to them, you know, like Little Rock, Arkansas. And it's interesting because the presidential libraries reflect the, you know, the president. Ours is built in Dutch colonial architecture. He loved that. The Clinton Presidential Library was supposed to be built out over the Arkansas River, and then it was pulled back and built on land. It was supposed to be, because remember his campaign thing was bridge to the 21st century. The idea was the Presidential Library was going to be built out over the Arkansas River as like a bridge to the 21st century. After 9/11, they slid it back because it was too tough to protect. President Ford has two places. One place for his archives and one place for his museum. And he picked that because he was a congressional representative from one spot and he went to college in another spot. Some people say, are you sure it wasn't just because he was president for 2 years, so he has one in each spot, two presidential libraries? It's like, no, he divided it up the other way, right? Interestingly enough, President Ford, only president, never elected president. Let's go here, then we're going to Yes.
Talking about the other libraries, I'm assuming that you visited a couple.
Yeah.
What other ones of note would you say go visit?
I would go to the one right down the road here. Actually, no, it's interesting because they all have their own style, they all have their own thing to their presidents. There's very little, if any, competition among the presidential libraries, believe it or not. Whether they're Democratic or Republican, it doesn't matter. It's a very exclusive club, right? There's only been 47 presidents of the United States. Only 12 of them have presidential libraries. So it's a really exclusive club. Everybody has things they could be proud of. Everybody has things that they are not so proud of. And there's no competition between us. I cannot compete with the Kennedy Library, who put a man on the moon and had, you know, all the fancy Camelot stuff. But they can't compete with a 4-term president in a wheelchair who got us through the Great Depression and the Second World War. So that levels the playing field, all that sort of stuff. If you're asking me some of my favorite presidential libraries, the two that I am most impressed with, outside of our own, of course, because my boss might be watching, but outside of our own would be the Johnson Presidential Library, right down in Texas. And what I found amazing about that is President Johnson, of course, gets tangled into the Vietnam War. And when you think of Johnson, you think of the Vietnam War. And when you go to the Presidential Library, his Presidential Library, that's part of it, the story. But he also had the Great Society, right? He's the guy that started public television. He's the guy that expanded the lunch program. He's the guy that passed voting rights, housing rights, you know, all these kinds of things that he did. And you go there and think, oh, wow, I forgot about that. That's right, he did all that stuff too. Then the other presidential library that has the same impact, the same effect, is the George Bush, the first presidential library, 41. Because every time you go around a corner, you go, oh my God, I forgot he was a war hero, right? Shot down in the Pacific. I forgot he was a congressman. Oh, I forgot he was the ambassador to the United Nations. Oh, I forgot he was head of the CIA. Oh, I forgot he was a vice president. Oh, I forgot he was on the committee that helped, you know, the raid on Entebbe. You know, it's like, holy crap, this guy did pretty well. You know, and you forget all this stuff because when you think of George Bush, you think of him looking at his watch, losing the debate, and hating broccoli. Right? So, I mean, you know, so those are two that I personally really like. But the thing that's amazing about all of them is the lack of competition and the genuine effort to show their president warts and all. Right? These are not just shrines to, oh, how great these guys were. these guys were guys, right? These guys were human beings. And the presidential libraries are there to show you that. That there were good decisions they made, there were bad decisions they made. And, they were under a lot of pressure. It's a great opportunity to learn not just about their presidency, but about the time in which they served. So it really is a great opportunity to go and get a sense of, wow. Like Hoover is another one, right? Hoover was a rotten president by most people's standards, but he was a great guy, right? He was a self-made millionaire. He was hardworking. He fed folks after the war, right? He was the head of the whole humanitarian efforts and all that sort of stuff. He lived until the 1960s, and this guy was a really, pulled himself up from the bootstraps kind of a guy. And, we think of him as glum old Hoover who, got us into the Great Depression and had to get bailed out by our guy. That's how we think of him. Oh, just kidding. It's definitely worth a trip to any presidential library, if they are really presidential libraries, because there are some that are not official part of the National Archives, right? They call themselves presidential libraries, but they're not part of the National Archives and Records Administration. It's like the Lincoln Presidential Library in Illinois. It's not really part of the National Archives, but it's a presidential library in that sense. Yes?
Can you say just a little bit about the new special exhibit at the library?
Sure. We have a new special exhibit at the library. It's actually only going to be up for about another 6 weeks or so. And it is called Signature Moments. And it is, I think there's close to 100 letters, telegrams, those sorts of things from famous people of the Roosevelt era. And it's got everything from everybody's documents with signatures on them, from Mussolini to Shirley Temple, to Helen Keller, to J. Robert Oppenheimer, to the Dalai Lama, to Harpo Marx. And these are all people who wrote to the Roosevelts. And one of the difficult things that I have with my job is, so you got to take all this old ancient history. You guys do the same thing, right? Because you're all historians. And you got to take all this old ancient history and you got to make it exciting to people. You got to make it interesting to young people. And so when we put this exhibit up, I'm like, what the hell? Who's going to care about old signatures from people they've never even heard of? Right? One of the only people that people recognize, students recognize, is Walt Disney. Right? Because his signature is actually the signature, the logo. So they know him from Shrek. Oh, Shrek guy! It's like, yeah, sure, right, that's that guy. So the way I cracked the nut with that was, you have to be hip and down and all, like with the kids and everything. So I said, well, you know what? These people, these 100 signatures, these people were like influencers of their time. Right? All the kids, now they know, right? So, this is like, Roy Rogers was like the Beyonce of back then, or other way around, right, So that's how we made the connection, right? You look for these ways to make the connections with the kids. These people were influencers. These were movers and shakers in science, in industry, in social stuff, in political things, in military stuff, all those things that were having an interaction and a reaction with the President and Mrs. Roosevelt, and helping them to shape policy and craft ideas and those sorts of things. So if you haven't been over there, come on over and take a peek. It's pretty cool stuff. And you'll be amazed at some of the handwriting. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. Yes.
Didn't Roosevelt have a large art collection?
He still does.
He still does.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's underground, right? A lot of it's...
Well, we have a little section down, it's...
We're going down there.
Yeah, you go down to the basement.
Paul was actually right.
Yeah. So if you go down to the basement, there is an area that's called visible storage. All right, so you're out there, you're looking through the Eleanor Roosevelt Gallery, you come up the steps, then you go through this doorway, and it's 6 degrees cooler than it was where you just were. You're thinking, what happened here? Well, you're now in visible storage. All right, it's not really a curated display. And the president was a great collector of art. He loved to collect art. A lot of the art was sent to him by people who did it in the New Deal, like the New Deal artists and such. And so what we have is in the storage area there, they have them on these racks. And there's probably like 12 or 15 racks on each side. And the art is hung on them. And then what we do is we the racks are on like tracks, they're track racks. Okay, try saying that 10 times fast. And so what we periodically do, we'll pull out different racks from on the tracks, so that way you're able to get a better sense of the kind of artwork that's in there. We only can put out 3% of what we have. We don't have the space, right? I mean, it's just
So do you
the
ever
space
have
isn't
an
there.
exhibit at the museum of just his art collection?
We have not, but there's an idea for you. And that's the thing, right? There's so many things you can do and so many things you can talk about. But I'll say this about art with FDR. He was a huge believer in the arts, not just the visual arts of painting and sculpture and that sort of stuff, but sound arts, dancing, music, singing, performance art, all that sort of stuff. And he pushed for these things through a thing called Project One, which was the federal project to create art. And part of the reason was because he wanted to give artists jobs, right? You go to the Hyde Park Post Office, those murals, those sorts of things, right? He wanted to give artists jobs, but he also believed that art was critically important to democracy and important to our mental health. Because here we were in this throes of the Great Depression, and what are you doing, paying artists? People are starving. No, they have to eat too. And he understood it's not always going to be this way, right? We need to develop art. We need to develop people's creativity. We need to allow people freedom of expression. One of his 4 freedoms. Well, how do you express? I dance. How do you express? I paint. I sing. I sculpt. These are all parts of that freedom of expression.
You're talking about the same things.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's important, to have those kinds of things. And he really understood that, and he really recognized that. And there are great pieces of art all across this country. WPA murals and sculptures and all sorts of things, buildings with this stuff in them, because he insisted on that stuff going along and being part of that as well. Pretty damn cool guy. And do you know something? He once ran against a guy, he's Thomas Dewey over in Poland, right? So Thomas Dewey is most famous for getting his butt kicked by Truman, but Roosevelt kicked his butt first. Right? And if he hadn't, there'd be a presidential library over on the other side of the county as well. Then you would have seen some competition. Yes, sir?
2 questions. How is all the other presidential memorabilia stored? We don't have libraries. And number 2 is FDR's car still run in the basement?
It doesn't get very far, I gotta tell you. So the other presidential libraries memorabilia stuff, if there's not a presidential library, it's not, it's out in private collections, or it's just out there, people have it, So that's why preserving these things is kind of so important, because it's not just, about the president, but it's about that time frame that they lived in as well. Okay, so that's that. In terms of the car had to be disassembled to get it to the basement. It was like basically in 2 parts, and then it was reassembled down there, drained of all the oil, and then when we did the renovation 12 or 13 years ago, we couldn't get it out of the building, so they built a giant crate over it. And it was, like a temperature-controlled crate, that the car stayed in while the construction went on all around it and such. They say, I don't know if it's true, but they say if you cranked it up and put all the oil and stuff back in, it probably would still work. I don't know, but don't try it. Whatever you're doing. Anything else? Yes.
What happened to all the ice boats?
What happened to all the ice boats? Good question. The ice boats were gotten rid of. They were given away, and the New York State Museum has some. I believe the Maritime Museum up in Kingston has one, and then there's I think there's 1 or 2 in private hands as well. And we have each year the ice boat display. The last 4 or 5 years. About 6 years ago, I lost track with the pandemic. We had them out on the front lawn, and then the last couple of years we've been having them in the multi-purpose rooms. And those things are cool. and those things are just like, you tell people about ice boats, ice boat, and then they see them like, holy crap, that's an ice boat. Yeah, it's big. And those things were like, those things went fast, like 60 miles an hour over the ice, like this far off the ice. Not for me.
I know that Churchill spent a lot of time hanging out at the White House. Did he make it to Hyde Park?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was here very often. He was, Churchill's one of those kind of guys who says, hey, come on over sometime. Oh, that's him now. Wow, that guy just doesn't give up. Tell him I'm not here. So yeah, he would come to Hyde Park and stay at Hyde Park. He would come sometimes and stay for months in the White House. One of the things I find so amazing is he came in December of 1941, and the president insisted that the national Christmas tree still be lit. And it was like 20 yards off the edge of the White House, right? So you got this giant 25-foot tree with all kinds of colored lights, 20 yards from the White House, and we've just been attacked at Pearl Harbor. And, the military was, oh, we can't do that, it'll be a beacon for enemy planes and all that sort of stuff. And FDR said, it'll be a beacon for the Christmas spirit, and we're going to light this puppy. And he did it. And lo and behold, Winston Churchill was there on the porch, when he did it. So here you are, 3 weeks into the Second World War, and 2 out of the big 3 are standing on a porch 20 yards off from a giant light. That's what Roosevelt believed. We needed to have that Christmas spirit. Despite what happened at Pearl Harbor, right? People needed to have something bright, something to look forward to, something to feel good about. Oops, in that dark.
That's why he kept baseball going.
That's exactly right. That's why he did the green light letter for baseball. Yeah, we got to do it. People are going to be hurting. People are going to be worrying. People are going to be needing a distraction. Let's do baseball. So, that's pretty cool there too. I mean, it's incredible what this guy got done. Yes.
I understand that most of the documents at the FDR Museum are not the real thing because of the light requirements, that they're really facsimiles. So my question is, how old, when were they created and how?
The facsimiles, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. Wherever possible, we put out original documents, right? Because that's the whole idea, to have the authentic real life document. There are restrictions on that, what you can put out and how long you can put it out. Generally speaking, I think the rule is you can have something out for one year out of every 10 years, okay? So, on display. So then what does that mean? What is a year? Is it 365 days? Or, and what is a day? Is a day 24 hours, or is it just the 9 hours you're open? Right, so then it gets into all this, people fighting back and forth about that sort of thing. For preservation purposes, sometimes you can't put out, like if you came to do research, you wouldn't get the real Day of Infamy speech. You would get a copy of that, right? Because the original is just too valuable to have, people messing around with. But there's a company that can do the facsimiles, and they're excellent at it. And, we always will put down in the bottom corner facsimile, right? Because we don't want to mislead anybody. But you also don't want to, overdo it because it ruins the magic of it. You go to a movie, that's, whoever that is, that, they're playing a character of that. But you don't want to, you don't want to like refer to by their first name. You want them to be in character. And the same idea with the documents. Why, are you looking for getting some documents faked? But what a crowd. This guy's got a shovel. Oh, they're sitting together. Ooh! It's a gang over here. Okay.
So were they redone for 2013 when you renewed the exhibits?
Well, it depends on, some of them were out for a while, some of them were redone and done as facsimiles. The facsimiles are modern, so they don't deteriorate the way a real life document would. The other thing people don't understand is a lot of our stuff is on what's called onion paper. Right? Like when you buy a new shirt and it comes in that white paper, that's essentially what onion paper was. And that was used a lot during the war because it was lighter. So if you were going to ship it and things, it was lighter to send it. And so you use less gas, you use less oil, you use less rubber. Wow. So those documents are very, very, delicate and such. So, but we have a fantastic archives team. We have a fantastic curation team. And these guys are top notch, and it's absolutely an honor to work with them, and it's an honor to have them like here in our community. Now, I get the beauty of being able to come out and talk to great people like you, and I do a lot of talks, and I do a lot of distance learning and all that sort of thing. So I'm kind of like a lot of times the public face of the library, for better or worse. But you don't generally see the curator, you don't generally see the archivist. But those are the folks that are behind the scenes doing this incredible work. And I always feel, and this sounds weird, but this is how I honestly genuinely feel. I feel like it must have been like to be one of the Beatles. Like if you're one of the 4 Beatles, you're a Beatle. Right? And some days you're out there, you're Paul McCartney, and you're singing Yesterday, and you got the spotlight, and everybody's looking at you. Other days you're just Ringo in the back, keeping a steady beat. But on any day, you're a Beatle. So to be able to go in and work with people like Herman Everhart, our museum curator, Kirsten Carter, our supervisory archivist, Cliff Lawby, our public programs guy, many of you know him. It's just, sometimes you walk in there and you say, how did I get this job? Other than the court order. There you go. So. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Are you your curator or archivist born in Hyde Park? From Hyde Park?
Born in Hyde Park. Not that I'm aware of.
Does history rub off on anybody and they pursue a career in this work?
Well, that's one of the things that we do every day. Just this morning I had 90 students in that are interested in becoming museum types. And I talk with them and, kind of give them a lowdown of what you might want to do and how all the things that go into it, what you might want to do and study for school and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, it really is, like you guys, right? Again, you guys, it's so cool to be here talking to you guys because you guys know what we're talking about, right? I mean, you're all history buffs because you had some history person in your life that inspired you to be into history. And you've got young people in your life that you're inspiring to be interested and involved in this stuff as well. And, and if you don't, you need to get them, right? Like she said, get these folks out to these kinds of things. Get excited about this stuff. And so, yeah, we have, classes that come in to learn about how we do things and such. And I think it's really important because, if you don't take care of this stuff, it's not going to be there, And if it's not there, we have no chance of learning from it. If it is there, we have a big chance of learning from it. And the more careful we are, the more cautious we are, the more curious we are, the more we're going to learn. And that's really what it's all about. And, it's amazing to think these guys buried over here, 80 years ago, and here we are still talking about it. Right? I mean, I know people are, aren't going to be talking about me 80 years from now. I know the neighbors are, but, there you go. Okay, so thanks for having me in. Good to see you all. And thank all of you for the work you guys are doing with the Hyde Park Historical Association. Wonderful, wonderful work, wonderful, wonderful job. Good going.